I'd trade 10 herds for one night inside you." The lonely cowboy's whispered words hung in the prairie air between them, raw and desperate and honest, in a way Dalton Kirby hadn't been honest in 7 years. 10 herds, 3,000 head of prime Hereford cattle. More wealth than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. The lonely cowboy had just offered it all for one night inside Temperance Blackwood, and he meant every damned word. Then the giant widow laughed. "One night won't be enough," Temperance said, and the lonely cowboy felt those words go through him like a bullet. And she was right, would be words that haunted Dalton Kirby for the rest of his days, because the giant widow knew exactly what one night inside her would do to a lonely cowboy who'd forgotten how to feel. The lonely cowboy standing in that prairie grass was Dalton Kirby, richest rancher in 3 counties, owner of the Double K Ranch's 30,000 acres, the man whose Herefords won prizes from Cheyenne to Denver. Men feared him, bankers courted him, railroad magnates sought his favor. The lonely cowboy had built an empire on grief, spending 7 years hiding behind 10 herds of cattle because his wife Martha had died screaming in childbirth, taking their son, taking everything that mattered, until the lonely cowboy had watched the giant widow stop a charging steer with her bare hands 3 weeks ago and felt something dead inside him violently wake. The giant widow sitting above him was Temperance Blackwood, 34 years old, powerful as 3 men, broad-shouldered and strong-handed, and called unnatural by every cruel tongue in Wyoming territory. The giant widow had been married to Josiah Blackwood, who'd wanted a work partner, not a wife to cherish. For 34 years, the giant widow had been useful instead of desired, necessary instead of wanted. Men had used her strength, relied on her labor, but no man had ever whispered to the giant widow that he'd trade 10 herds, trade everything, for one night inside her. No lonely cowboy had ever looked at the giant widow like she was salvation. Until now. "One night won't be enough," the giant widow repeated, dismounting in one powerful motion that made the lonely cowboy's breath catch. Suddenly, she stood before him, towering, magnificent, and Dalton had to tilt his head back to meet her eyes. "You think you can whisper, 'I'd trade 10 herds for one night inside you,' and then walk away after? You think one night inside me won't ruin you?" "I'm already ruined," the lonely cowboy said, his hand rising to the giant widow's face. "I've been dead 7 years. One night inside, you is resurrection." "Then come inside," the giant widow whispered, and took the lonely cowboy's hand in hers, those massive calloused fingers closing around his like a vow. "Come inside my house, come inside my life, come inside me, and we'll see if you still think 10 herds was a fair trade when the sun rises." The lonely cowboy followed the giant widow toward her ranch house, not knowing that by morning everything he'd believed about himself would be shattered, not knowing that the giant widow had secrets that would make 10 herds seem like pocket change, not knowing that 3 people were watching them from the ridge, and one of them was already riding hard toward town to destroy them both. 3 weeks earlier, at the Sweetwater Autumn Cattle Fair, the lonely cowboy had been standing at the auction pen rails watching his prize Hereford sell for record prices and feeling absolutely nothing. 7 years since Martha died. 7 years of building an empire that meant nothing because he'd built it around a tomb. His foreman, Old Luther, kept talking about winter feed costs, but Dalton's mind was elsewhere, which is to say, nowhere at all. He was wealthy. He was successful. He was completely, utterly empty. Then the commotion started at Pen 7. A 2-year-old steer, maddened by the crowd, had broken through the rails. Men were scattering, shouting, and the animal, 1,500 pounds of panicked beef, was charging straight toward a cluster of children near the cotton candy vendor. Dalton's boots hit the ground running, but he was too far away, and he knew it, and he felt his heart seize with familiar helplessness, the same helplessness he'd felt when Martha's screams had filled their bedroom, and there was nothing he could do, nothing. A woman stepped into the steer's path. Not stepped, planted herself. She was massive, taller than any man at the fair, with shoulders like a working draft horse. As the steer charged, she moved with surprising grace, sidestepping at the last second and catching the animal's horns. The impact should have thrown her. Instead, she pivoted, using the steer's momentum against it, and brought the animal down to its knees. She held it there, muscles straining against calico sleeves, until 3 men rushed in with ropes. When she stood, brushing dust from her skirts, the lonely cowboy realized he was staring, and for the first time in 7 years he was feeling something. Not just arousal, though God help him, there was that, but something bigger, something like recognition. like his soul had been asleep and suddenly someone had shaken it awake. She caught him staring and her face shuddered closed. "Show's over, Mr. Kirby." She knew his name. Everyone did. "Children are safe. You can go back to your business now." "How did you—" he started. "I'm strong," the giant widow said, her voice flat and defensive. "That's what happens when you're born wrong. Good for livestock, not much else." She turned to leave, and the lonely cowboy felt panic rise in his chest, the first sharp feeling in years. "Wait, I don't know your name." "Temperance Blackwood. They call me Tem, Josiah Blackwood's widow, from the Blackwood place 10 miles north of your spread." She said it like a challenge, like she was daring him to remember her dead husband's name, to place her in the proper category of people he could safely ignore. "Now you know, and now you can forget like everyone else does." But the lonely cowboy didn't forget. For 3 weeks he couldn't stop thinking about the giant widow. The way she'd moved, the way her eyes had flashed when she'd called herself born wrong, the way his dead heart had suddenly, inexplicably, started beating again. He made excuses to ride past her property. He asked old Luther casual questions about the Blackwood place. He learned that Josiah had died 2 years ago from pneumonia, that the giant widow ran the ranch alone now, that she came to town once a month for supplies, and the shopkeepers whispered about her after she left. Unnatural, they called her, more man than woman. Poor Josiah, married to that creature. The lonely cowboy wanted to break their teeth. Instead, he did something more dangerous. He rode to her property one afternoon with a legitimate excuse. Some of his cattle had wandered onto her land, and found the giant widow mending fence in the October sun. She wore men's work pants and a simple cotton shirt, her dark hair tied back, and when she saw the lonely cowboy approaching, something like resignation crossed her face. "Your cattle are in the north pasture, Mr. Kirby," she said without greeting. "I'll help you round them up. No charge. Neighbors help neighbors, even when one neighbor owns half the territory and the other barely scrapes by." "I didn't come for the cattle," the lonely cowboy said, and the giant widow went very still. "Then why did you come?" "Because I haven't stopped thinking about you since the day you saved those children. Because when I close my eyes, I see you. Because I've been dead inside for 7 years, and you made me feel alive." The words tumbled out of the lonely cowboy like he was confessing sins. "Because I look at you and I see everything I've been too afraid to want." The giant widow laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "You don't want me, Mr. Kirby. You want the idea of me, the novelty. Rich men like you, sometimes you get curious about women like me. But when morning comes and you remember who you are—" "I know exactly who I am," the lonely cowboy interrupted. "I'm a man who's been hiding behind money and cattle because he's afraid to live. I'm a man who built an empire around a grave. I'm a man who watched you stop that steer and realized he's been settling for existing when he could be living." "Pretty words," the giant widow said, but her voice was shaking. "But words don't mean much when the whole territory thinks I'm a freak." "I don't think you're a freak. I think you're the most magnificent thing I've ever seen." For 3 weeks after that, the lonely cowboy found reasons to visit the giant widow's ranch, helping with fence repairs, bringing supplies from town, sharing meals in her simple kitchen. They talked, really talked, about things the lonely cowboy had never shared with anyone. About Martha's death, about the guilt of surviving when she didn't, about the way grief had hollowed him out until there was nothing left but work and more work and the endless emptiness of a big house with no one in it. And the giant widow talked too, about growing up too big, too strong, too much, about her father who'd called her a waste of a woman's body, about Josiah who'd been kind but never desired her, who'd married her for her strength and treated her like a business partner, not a wife, about the loneliness of being useful but never wanted. "I've never been small enough to love," the giant widow had whispered one evening, and the lonely cowboy had taken her face in his hands, had to stand on his toes to reach her, and said, "Good, because I don't want small. I want you." But they hadn't crossed that final line. Not yet. Both of them were too scared, too aware of what it would mean, too frightened of the vulnerability that came with actually having something to lose again. Until today. Until the lonely cowboy had ridden to her property and found the giant widow on her horse, heading out to check her cattle, and something in him had just broken open. All the careful restraint, all the fear, all the walls, gone. Just raw want and desperate honesty and the terrifying knowledge that he couldn't wait anymore. "I'd trade 10 herds for 1 night inside you," the lonely cowboy had whispered, and meant it with every fiber of his being. And now, here they were, walking toward her ranch house hand in hand, the giant widow's massive fingers wrapped around his, and the lonely cowboy could feel his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. The setting sun painted the sky gold and red, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed, and the wind smelled like prairie grass in the giant widow's skin. And Dalton Kirby thought, this is what being alive feels like. The giant widow's ranch house was small but well kept, a simple two-room structure with a stone fireplace and rough-hewn furniture that Josiah had built. She led the lonely cowboy inside, and the moment the door closed behind them, everything changed. The air felt thicker, electric, charged with 7 years of loneliness, meeting 34 years of never being desired. "I need you to understand something," the giant widow said, and her voice was shaking. "Once this happens, I won't be able to pretend anymore. I won't be able to smile and nod when you ride past without stopping. I won't be able to survive you treating this like it didn't matter." "It matters," the lonely cowboy said fiercely. "You matter. This matters more than 10 herds, more than my ranch, more than anything." "Then show me," the giant widow whispered. "Show me what it feels like to be wanted, not just needed. Show me what it feels like to be desired, not just useful." The lonely cowboy reached up, had to reach so far up, and pulled the giant widow's face down to his. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, two broken people terrified of breaking each other. But then something ignited, something that had been dormant in both of them for far too long, and the kiss deepened, and the giant widow's massive hands were in the lonely cowboy's hair, and he was pulling her closer, closer, trying to erase 7 years of emptiness and 34 years of being unwanted in a single moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the giant widow was crying. "Why are you crying?" the lonely cowboy asked, wiping tears from her face. "Because I didn't think this was possible," the giant widow whispered. "I didn't think anyone would ever look at me the way you're looking at me right now." "Then you haven't been looking in the right mirrors," the lonely cowboy said, "because you're beautiful. You're so damned beautiful it hurts to look at you." What happened next was tender and fierce and desperate all at once. Two people who'd been starving finally allowed to feast, two souls who'd been separate finally allowed to merge. And when the lonely cowboy was finally inside the giant widow, inside her body, inside her heart, inside the very core of who she was, he understood what she'd meant when she'd said one night wouldn't be enough. Because this wasn't just physical. This was spiritual. This was two broken pieces fitting together and becoming whole. This was resurrection for both of them. But 3 miles away, on a ridge overlooking the Blackwood place, 3 riders sat on their horses and watched smoke rise from the giant widow's chimney. One of them was Virgil Ashford, the lonely cowboy's business partner. One was Mrs. Cordelia Ashford, Virgil's wife, and the most vicious gossip in Wyoming territory, and one was Silas Hartwell, owner of the railroad contracts that kept the lonely cowboy's empire running, and father of the delicate widow Penelope Hartwell, who'd been expecting Dalton Kirby to court her properly. "Well," Mrs. Cordelia said, her voice dripping with satisfaction, "now we know where Mr. Kirby has been spending his time, with that creature." "This changes everything," Silas Hartwell said coldly. "I will not do business with a man who associates with unnatural women. I will not have my daughter embarrassed by his preferences." "We need to handle this carefully," Virgil said, but his eyes were calculating. "Dalton controls too much territory. But if we can discredit him, make him a laughingstock, force him to choose between that woman and his business interests, then we can take what should have been ours all along," Mrs. Cordelia finished. "The Double K Ranch, his cattle, his contracts, everything." Silas Hartwell smiled. "By tomorrow morning, everyone in Cheyenne will know that the great Dalton Kirby is rutting with the giant widow like an animal. By next week, he'll be ruined, unless he publicly denounces her and begs our forgiveness." "And if he doesn't?" Virgil asked. "Then we destroy them both," Silas said simply. The 3 riders turned their horses toward town, and Mrs. Cordelia was already composing the letters she'd send to every influential family in the territory, letters that would paint the lonely cowboy as a man who'd lost his mind and the giant widow as the unnatural creature who'd seduced him. By morning, the war would begin. But inside the small ranch house, the lonely cowboy and the giant widow knew nothing of the storm that was coming. They were too lost in each other, too consumed by the desperate joy of finally being seen and wanted and cherished. The lonely cowboy traced the giant widow's face with shaking fingers, memorizing every feature. The giant widow held the lonely cowboy like he was precious, like he was breakable, like he was everything. "One night won't be enough," the giant widow whispered again, and this time it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. "A lifetime won't be enough," the lonely cowboy answered and kissed her again, and neither of them noticed the darkness gathering on the horizon, or the enemies sharpening their knives, or the impossible choice that was coming, a choice between love and empire, between the giant widow and everything the lonely cowboy had built, between being alive and being safe. Because she was right. One night would never, ever be enough, but would they survive what came next? Morning light crept through the windows of the giant widow's ranch house, painting golden stripes across tangled sheets and intertwined bodies. The lonely cowboy woke first, his arm numb beneath the giant widow's head, and for the first time in 7 years, he didn't feel the crushing weight of grief the moment consciousness returned. Instead, he felt peace. He felt whole. Temperance stirred beside him, those massive arms tightening around his waist, and when her eyes opened and found his face, she smiled. Really smiled. Not the guarded half-smile she showed the world, but something genuine and vulnerable and breathtaking. "Morning," the lonely cowboy whispered, brushing dark hair from her face. "Morning," the giant widow whispered back. "You're still here. Where else would I be?" "Gone." Her voice was soft but honest. "Men usually leave before dawn. Easier that way. Less awkward. I'm not other men." Dalton kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "And I meant what I said. 10 herds, Tem. I'd trade it all for this. For you." The giant widow's eyes filled with tears. "You say that now. But when you ride back to your ranch, when you see what you've built, when your business partners start asking questions, let them ask." The lonely cowboy sat up, pulling the giant widow with him. "I don't care what they think. I care about you." But before the giant widow could respond, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the morning peace. Not just one horse, many. The lonely cowboy and the giant widow scrambled from bed, dressing quickly, and when they reached the window, what they saw made both their hearts stop. At least 20 riders surrounded the ranch house, and at their head was Virgil Ashford, sitting tall in his saddle with a piece of paper in his hand. "Dalton Kirby," Virgil's voice carried across the yard. "Come out here and face what you've done." The lonely cowboy's jaw tightened. "Stay inside." "Like hell," the giant widow said, already moving toward the door. "This is my property, my home. Tem, please." But the giant widow was already outside, standing on her porch in her simple dress, every inch of her 6.5-foot frame radiating defiance. The lonely cowboy followed, positioning himself beside her, and he could feel the tension rolling off the crowd like heat from a fire. Virgil held up the paper. "This is a petition signed by 50 respectable citizens of Cheyenne, demanding that you, Dalton Kirby, cease your unnatural association with this creature. You are ordered to return to proper society and seek forgiveness from those you've offended with your perverse behavior." "Perverse?" The lonely cowboy's voice was deadly quiet. "Choosing to be with a woman I care about is perverse?" "She's not a woman," Mrs. Cordelia Ashford called from the crowd, her voice sharp with malice. "She's an abomination, 6 feet of unnatural strength packed into a dress, and you, Mr. Kirby, have disgraced yourself by whatever depraved acts you committed under her roof." The giant widow flinched, and the lonely cowboy felt rage flood through him. "Choose your next words carefully, Mrs. Ashford," Dalton said, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip, "because if you insult her again, we're going to have a problem." "The problem," Silas Hartwell said, riding forward on a black stallion, "is that you've broken your word, Kirby. You were courting my daughter Penelope. You gave her reason to believe you'd marry her, and now we find you've been sneaking around with this thing." "I never courted Penelope," the lonely cowboy said. "I had dinner at your house twice because you insisted. I never made promises. You accepted our hospitality. You discussed business. You allowed expectations to form." Silas's eyes were cold. "And now you've humiliated my daughter by choosing this over her." The giant widow's voice was steady, but Dalton could hear the pain underneath. "Nobody's forcing Mr. Kirby to be here. He's free to leave anytime he wants, free to go back to his respectable life." "That's exactly what he's going to do," Virgil said, "because if he doesn't, we're canceling every business contract, every railroad agreement, every banking arrangement. By next month, the Double K Ranch will be worthless." The lonely cowboy felt the trap close around him. 7 years of work, 30,000 acres, 10 herds of prize cattle, his entire empire built on the ashes of his grief, now being held hostage. "And if I refuse?" Dalton asked. "Then we destroy you both," Virgil said simply. "We'll spread word that you've lost your mind. that you're unfit to do business, that you're a dangerous man who associates with dangerous women. Your cattle won't sell, your hands will quit, your reputation will be ashes." The crowd murmured agreement, and the lonely cowboy could see the hunger in their eyes. They wanted him to fall. They wanted him to be brought low. They wanted him to choose empire over love, safety over life, because that's what respectable people did. The lonely cowboy looked at the giant widow, and she was crying silently, her massive shoulders shaking. "Go," Temperance whispered. "Save yourself, Dalton. I always knew this would happen. I always knew one night wouldn't be enough, wouldn't be worth what it would cost you." "You're wrong," the lonely cowboy said, and then he turned to face the crowd, and he made the choice that would change everything. "You want me to choose?" The lonely cowboy's voice rang across the yard. "Fine, I choose her." The crowd erupted in shock, but Dalton wasn't finished. He took the giant widow's massive hand in his, raised it high so everyone could see. "I choose Temperance Blackwood over every contract, every herd, every dollar I've ever made. You want my ranch? Take it. You want my cattle? They're yours. But you don't get to tell me how to live anymore." "You're insane," Virgil sputtered. "You're throwing away everything." "No," the lonely cowboy said, pulling the giant widow close. "I'm finally choosing everything that matters. For 7 years I hid behind money because I was too afraid to feel, but this woman taught me the difference between existing and living." He turned to face Temperance, and his voice broke. "You said one night wouldn't be enough. You were right, but not because I'd walk away. Because one night, 1 year, 1 lifetime won't be enough time to love you the way you deserve." The giant widow was sobbing now, her massive frame shaking as she pulled the lonely cowboy into her arms. "I'm not rich anymore," Dalton whispered against her chest. "I've got nothing to offer but myself." "That's all I ever wanted," Temperance whispered back. Behind them, Virgil was shouting orders, claiming the Double K Ranch, dividing up the spoils. The crowd was buzzing with scandal and satisfaction. Mrs. Cordelia was already composing her letters. Silas Hartwell was smiling coldly. But the lonely cowboy and the giant widow didn't care. Because 3 months later, when they stood in that Cheyenne Grand Hotel ballroom, Dalton working as a ranch hand now, Temperance running her small spread with his help, and he led her onto that dance floor while society gasped, they knew something the crowd would never understand. Some things are worth more than 10 herds. Some love is worth losing everything for. And one night wasn't enough, but it was enough to start a lifetime of being truly, completely, devastatingly alive. The lonely cowboy held the giant widow close as they danced, and she bent down to whisper in his ear. "No regrets?" "Not a single one," he whispered back. And he meant it, because Dalton Kirby had learned the most important lesson of his life. You can build an empire on grief and still be empty, or you can lose everything for love and finally be whole. He'd chosen whole. He'd chosen her, and she'd been right all along. One night would never be enough, but it was the perfect beginning.